and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dina. Hello, everyone. Welcome once again. Really delighted to have you here with us for this panel. My name is Pedi, Obani, and I'm delighted to have colleagues with me from the School of Law, University of Bradford, but also other partner institutions that we work with. So this panel or this session, we've tailored it to be a panel discussion, but first, because it's a summer school, we thought it would be important to start out with a presentation that sort of lays the background around these issues of the connections between plastics pollution and the climate crisis, and indeed the role of the right to a healthy environment and how we can use that as an instrument for advancing the solution to the twin crisis, not leaving out the political economy issues, because of course we know that the various solutions that have been projected for addressing whether it's a climate crisis or the plastics pollution crisis always have political economy aspects to them. So we'll be exploring all of those within today's conversation. So I'm delighted to have with me here colleagues. I have Dr. Irekpitan Okukpon, who's also from the School of Law, University of Bradford. And then we have Dr. Adenike Akinsemolu, who is the director of the Green Institute. She's also an OG's IAS Vanguard Fellow with the University of Birmingham. And then we have Scott Backler, who is a climate change development consultant. We will also be joined by Professor Engobo Emeseh, who's the head of school, University of Bradford. And with that, without further ado, oh yeah, so Professor Emeseh is here as well. So this is the panel. So like I said, we'll start with a presentation and then we'll move on to a conversation. The idea is we would want you to also send in your questions as the panel goes along so that we can address any questions you have. We want it to be as interactive as possible. So please send in your questions. And if at any point you want to come to the mic, also indicate and we'll invite you to use the mic. So it's over to you, Dr. Okukpon. Would you want to share your screen or do you want me to do that?
If you could help me share the screen, that would be fine. Thank you, Pedi.
All right, no worries. Okay. Can you see my screen yet? Yeah, excellent. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bani. Okay. How many minutes do I have, please?
You have about 20 minutes max.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Bani. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Irekpitan, and I will be discussing the political economy of climate and plastics crisis, advancing sustainable solutions through the right to a healthy environment. This presentation kind of sets the scene for the robust discussions that we're going to have during the panel session. So I'll be talking about the impact of this plastic pollution globally, connecting the links between climate change and plastic pollution, emphasizing the intersections with the right to a healthy environment, and also discussing regulatory frameworks and approaches for addressing plastic pollution. Plastic pollution is regarded as one of the biggest environmental challenges we have globally. With the increase in global human population, advancement in technology, the amount of plastic waste that has been generated globally amounts to about 400 million metric tons per year. And this is interesting because we see an increase in the past few years from 1950, when it was just 15 million tons generated, to present day, which is about 400 million metric tons, with the proponent or the potential to increase by 2050. Now, before we begin the discussion proper, what are the types of plastics that we're actually referring to? We're referring to carbonated drink bottles, for example, PET bottles, single-use plastics like grocery bags, plastic bottles, food containers, vending cups, plastics found in electronics, etc. Now, for us to understand the problem with plastic pollution, we need to understand that not all plastics are biodegradable. That is, they are not easily broken down or into the environment as a result of the materials that are used to make these plastics. These plastics eventually become or break down into microplastics, and which, if ingested, causes a lot of harm to human health and humans and animals, I beg your pardon. Now, in terms of the impact that these plastics have on humans and the environment, I think I'll just do a short explanation of that. The first is the traditional methods of disposal, and I'm focusing on the end-of-life management of plastics in particular. In developing countries in particular, the traditional methods of disposal are open burning, open dumping, or landfilling. Now, in terms of open burning of plastics, including PET bottles, there is a dispersal of smoke containing carbon dioxide, dioxins, PCBs, mercury into the atmosphere. This causes air pollution, and the inhalation of such harmful gases causes one issue or the other for human beings. Post-consumer PET bottles can also be found in landfills, and this affects soil fertility. And then also the improper disposal of these PET bottles tend to block drainage pathways, which leads to flooding. With regards to the impact on animals, if ingested by animals, either land animals or aquatic animals, it could lead to blockage of the intestinal tract, and which leads to failure of the animals to reproduce, entanglement of organisms in the plastics, which eventually lead to suffocation and death, and other long-term effects. In fact, there has been recent studies that have emphasized that seabirds and sea turtles are particularly vulnerable to entanglement by these plastics as a result of improper disposal, which have found their way into the ocean. So taking us back now to this inextricable link between climate change and plastic pollution. Plastic pollution has been regarded in the past as an issue that is completely separate from the climate crisis. However, recent studies and recent evidence have shown that this is not the case, as it shouldn't be seen as an isolated topic, but it is one that shows or that reflects the link between climate change and plastic pollution. There's a linkage between both concepts. And this linkage is best shown through three key facts. The first is the production of plastics is heavily dependent on fossil fuel extraction. The second link is that due to unsustainable disposal practices for plastic waste, for example, open burning, incineration, open dumping, and landfilling, these contribute in no small way to the global greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And then thirdly, as a result of climate change, we have stronger winds, more frequent rain events, and this, of course, causes inputs of terrestrial plastic into the aquatic environment, and this, of course, causes flooding. So this linkage emphasizes that the climate and plastics crisis is a huge public policy issue, and it needs to be addressed through much more sustainable, integrated approaches. In view of these issues and in view of this linkage, it has become evident that this crisis, this twin crisis, could be viewed from a human rights lens. And this is because the impact of plastic pollution and climate change basically infringes on the fundamental human rights of individuals. And I'll explain further. Sometime in October 2021, a United Nations Human Rights Council resolution recognized the right to a healthy environment as a human right. And also in July 2022, the UN passed another resolution basically declaring that access to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a universal human right. Now, take note of the fact that these resolutions are merely resolutions and they are not binding, but it is a call for action for states to begin to implement their international obligations with regards to environmental pollution. It is a call for action for states to begin to consider the human rights element of these environmental issues. So as a result of this, in consideration of these recognition by the United Nations, the implications are threefold. The first is that there is a need for governments to be conscious of their international obligations through the various existing multilateral environmental agreements or treaties relating to climate change and plastics. Secondly, there is a need for governments, especially at the national level, to build upon or put in place legislation that recognizes this right to a healthy environment and how it should be enforced. The third is that recognition that climate change and plastic policies must be implemented together, because implementing one in isolation of the other does not solve the plastics crisis. And I'll expatiate on these three recognitions now. The first is the need for governments to be conscious of their international obligations. And speaking to the plastic pollution issue, the existing international treaty directly related to plastic pollution can be found in the key multilateral environmental treaty on waste, which is the Basel Convention 1989. The focus of this convention is on the environmentally sound management of hazardous waste and the control of the trade and transboundary movement of hazardous waste and the different waste streams. Over time, since its adoption in 1989, the treaty has been sufficiently amended, and it now reflects some kind of control regarding the trade in plastic waste and for exporting and importing countries, and they are able to control the trade and the environmental sound management of this type of plastic waste through the prior informed consent procedure. Sometime in 2019, as an offshoot to this treaty, a plastic waste partnership was adopted at the Conference of Parties to this treaty. And what this plastic waste partnership seeks to do is to mobilize stakeholders to come together to address this issue of plastic pollution on different fronts. And how can this be addressed? Through sustainable solutions for collecting, separating, and management of plastic waste, and also to foster innovations in the materials used in the production of plastics, especially because of the impacts and the effects it has on the environment and on climate change. In 2022, March 2022, the international community also recognized the need to have a global plastics treaty. And the uniqueness of this proposed treaty is the fact that apart from the usual prevention and reduction paradigms that have to do that are associated with plastic pollution, the treaty seeks to include provisions that will directly protect the right to health, the right to a healthy environment of populations and affected marginalized communities who are affected by this plastic pollution. While the Global Plastics Treaty is currently fraught with a lot of controversies by negotiating states, it is expected that by 2024, some form of agreement would have been reached by all state parties, and then this treaty will be particularly adopted. This is also because the Basel Convention has proven not to be wholly effective in the control of plastic waste and plastic pollution. Now, at the regional level, the European Union has also taken the lead by banning single-use plastic packaging for food and beverages, and has also put in place an agenda and different adaptation measures for different EU states aimed at making plastic packaging fully recyclable by 2030. And how do they want to achieve this? By completely redesigning plastics and creating a mandatory deposit return system, a system where consumers can take or package or keep used plastic bottles and then take them to a deposit return system or mechanism where you input the bottles and then you get some amount of money back. This is already being implemented in specific countries, for example, Finland. By October 2023, the UK is also planning to introduce this same deposit return scheme to facilitate recycling, and in that way, try to reduce plastic pollution and the amount of plastics that are being improperly disposed. This brings me to the second point regarding legislation versus litigation. At national levels, different countries have resorted to litigation to enforce this right to a healthy environment as a result of plastic pollution that they face. And this again situates the fact that the control of plastic pollution and climate change can be effected through a human rights lens. For example, in the Philippines, Oceana Philippa, a marine resource agency, brought an action against the government, particularly the National Solid Waste Management Commission, for failing, since the enactment of the environmental legislation in 2001, failing to prepare a list of non-environmentally acceptable products and packaging as required by the legislation. They hadn't done that. And so Oceana Philippa argued that the amount of plastic pollution being generated in Philippines could have been prevented if the National Solid Waste Management Commission had followed up on the requirements of the legislation to ensure that there is a list of non-environmentally acceptable products and the methods of their disposal. This action is currently before the Supreme Court, and we look forward to seeing what the outcome of that decision would be. In the United States, the Charleston Waterkeeper case, Charleston Waterkeeper and the Coastal Conservation League kind of sought federal remedies under the Clean Water Act of the United States and the Resources Conservation and Recovery Act against the company called Frontier Logistics. And the reason why they brought an action against the company was because the company kept discharging plastic pellets into a public river accessible to consumers. Frontier Logistics agreed to pay a settlement fee of $1.2 million to settle the lawsuit. Now, what we see, the difference between the two cases is that in the Oceana Philippa case, this action that was brought by Oceana was in tandem with what the Philippines Climate Change Commission had been seeking to do, which is the Philippines Climate Change Commission had been seeking to ensure that there is a nationwide ban and awareness on single-use plastics in the country to prevent plastic pollution. Now, what this means and what these two cases mean is that aggrieved parties have brought claims under existing environmental laws without relying on any plastic-specific legislation. So what these two cases have resulted in is reclassification of waters in which this pollution occurred, settlements reached for affected communities, suspended permits for the airing companies, and also suspend different remedies. But the question is this enough to solve the problem of plastic pollution and climate change? The question that arises is, wouldn't it be better to enforce this claim through climate-specific litigation instead? And the third point is, in order for us to achieve net zero plastic pollution, it requires a complete removal of plastic from the natural environment. And how can this be achieved? National agendas on climate change mitigation should also be developed alongside agendas on plastic pollution. And this basically means that having a policy on plastic pollution does not solve the problem of climate change. And having a climate policy does not solve the problem of plastic pollution. They cannot be viewed in isolation with each other. And so it is important that at national levels, there should be an exploration of the synergies that exist between these two issues and a reform of legislation that includes ways to tackle this crisis through enforcing the right to a healthy environment. Going forward, what we can do is to ensure that certain implementable measures are put in place. And the first is to adopt a circular economy approach to plastics. For example, the extended producer responsibility scheme and in existing waste legislation, which also is geared towards tackling pollution and to ensure that there is an effective management approach with regards to plastic waste and plastic pollution. Part of the circular economy approach also includes an adoption of the deposit return system. So that's an economic incentive for consumers. And then also the circular economy approach also requires some form of redesign of the plastic products, which do not basically require any reliance on fossil fuels, I beg your pardon, but the use of materials that are easily biodegradable or compostable in such a way that reduce the effects on the climate. Another thing that we can see as a sustainable solution is the recognition of the need to jointly implement both plastic and climate policies, which would help greatly in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from plastics. And so it is important that policymakers should actively support the decarbonization of the plastics life cycle as a climate mitigation option. And lastly, the consideration of an outright ban on single-use plastics. This might be difficult, particularly in developing countries, because if there is a cultural perception with regards to how plastic bags are used, it is going to be difficult to remove that cultural and social perception and usage of plastic bags, especially grocery bags, and say there should be an outright ban on that. So it remains to be seen how this plays out. My colleagues are also going to discuss further on some of the key issues I've mentioned here, and I hope that you enjoy the presentations and the sustainable solutions that we can advocate with regards to this twin crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irekpitan, for your presentation. I see smiles. I don't know if at this point anyone has any questions. Otherwise, we can start with the panelists and then invite everyone else to please come in with their questions. So, I mean, if it's okay, I'll start with you, Scott. Irekpitan's presentation has thrown up very important issues. First, the intersections between climate change and plastics, and of course, the enormity of the climate crisis, but also the plastics crisis. And this idea that we don't seem to be tackling both together, even though they're very closely linked, starting from how we even produce plastics, because a lot of the plastics are generated through fossil fuels, right? And the fact that even in the disposal of the plastics, we're also creating challenges from a climate change perspective. So they're really well connected throughout the life cycle of plastics. And she's also raised the interesting observation around how we tackle this through a human rights approach, but other legal aspects, which I'd like us to explore in a bit more detail as we carry on the conversation. But I think the first question would be, Scott, what do you see as the possible options for building climate change resilience, even as we tackle the plastics crisis?
So yeah, thank you very much, Pedi, and it's a pleasure to be here. I thank my colleagues at the University of Bradford and other partner institutions for having me here. And so resilience has really become a big buzzword in recent years around environmental management, along with other sort of terms like sustainability. And we really have to ask, resilience for who and how, and what does resilience even look like? And I'll get onto that in just a moment. So resilience is really applied to a lot of different disciplines, so it really lacks a sufficient definition when we're looking at the cumulative sort of problems of climate change and plastic pollution. But resilience overall is really about resisting and coping and effectively bouncing back when climate shocks occur. And these systems now will most necessarily need to go beyond bouncing back to where they were. And it's now important to sort of engage in a kind of more transformative process, because bouncing back to where communities were before, in the wake of the climate crisis expected to get worse, is no longer sufficient. So there has to be some kind of upgrading process and positive change beyond that. But most importantly, before turning to some of the options, resilience really begins with how it's framed. So I'm a big advocate for framing resilience and how we cope and resist these kinds of pressures in a cumulative way. As we've discussed, I think it's the human factors at grassroots level, as well as the climate-related factors working cumulatively and synergistically to exacerbate the whole situation, as we know. So I was really glad it was mentioned by the previous panelist about integrated policies, because you can't, I think, anymore have climate change policies. They need to be integrated with waste management and those kind of community perspectives as well. So considering human factors against a backdrop of climate change, such as it's plastic pollution, it's harmful livelihood practices, and it's also unsustainable human expansion. So I've got a case study as an example in Sierra Leone, a country in West Africa, It's really been impacted in the last few decades by a decade-long civil war, as well as the Ebola epidemic. So it's really had a lot of challenges come its way. And for some of the coastal informal settlements, also known as kind of slum areas, among lots of other words, are kind of characterized as unregulated, outside state control, very basic housing, and they're often low-lying coastal settlements, and they're very vulnerable to sea level rise, coastal erosion, storm surges, which, as we've discussed, are standalone problems. But in terms of the infrastructure and the inadequate waste management systems, plastic can find its way into the unsuitable drainage and cause a lot of problems. And so another example is the sort of ecosystem degradation, when with human expansion, cutting down the mangroves mean that they don't provide a safe haven for fish fauna, as well as also providing an inherent buffer against ocean waves and storm surges, which is commonly known as ecosystem services. And there's also, with the infrastructural aspects, there's human waste and open defecation, and due to the wash facilities not being present, again, if the flooding gets worse, then so does it becomes a health concern, along with the plastic pollution. So once we really delve into some of the options, there are some more clear-cut than others, and with a kind of political economy perspective as well, these types of communities lack capacities, and I've been really looking at mapping and analysing where these thresholds lie and where the capacities of institutions, if it's the government, NGOs or others, should support communities and how exactly they can do that. But there is a big but, and there is much to be said about power and politics. So who's making the decisions, and change for who, and on what basis? Because these types of communities, these tight-knit communities, have been there for generations with their own set of rules, governance structures, and there was a lot to be learned from them. And so I think it's increasingly becoming a kind of approach of involving these communities in the process of resilience. And we've seen it in a lot of examples. I know in New Zealand, policies are included a lot with Maori indigenous knowledge. And so there's lots of examples to draw from, but it has to be kind of both ways, it has to work both ways. So I know one of the concerns in an informal settlement in Sierra Leone when I went recently is they said, okay, we need proper training. We don't actually know how to lobby to the local governance structures. We don't know how to lobby in a concise way to be heard. So we need training for that. So it's really about understanding the needs of the community, understanding the grassroots dynamics at play, get on their level, respect their knowledge. And I know this because I've seen this firsthand, and they were really adamant, some of the community members, to explain this to me. And the second option as well I want to raise, or second potential option to go forward with is I think we really need to look towards nature itself. We may know about ecosystem services, but we really know when they're not there. So conserving, protecting and rebuilding critical ecosystems are very important, but more important than rebuilding them is making sure they're not sort of destroyed in the first place. And yeah, as we've discussed, some of the mechanisms for a circular economy are very important for that. So yeah, I hope that answers your questions, and I'm happy to take on any questions afterwards.
Thank you very much for that, Scott. Dina?
So, thank you for those for that really great presentation and for those comments. I mean, I guess what I've been thinking about as you've been talking. So I guess part of what I've been thinking about is obviously there sort of seem to be like two issues here. There's future production, and then there's the plastic we already have, right? And just thinking about the plastic we already have, I was thinking about how kind of deeply integrated it is sort of into our lives. Standing here wearing plastic earrings, but in kind of all sorts of aspects of our lives, it's very kind of part of our homes and our households and our daily lives, and and meaningfully so, it's been a material of kind of accessibility and economic access in circumstances where other materials wouldn't be accessible. And I went to a really interesting exhibition the other day about Tories, straight islanders who are replacing beads in traditional cultural beading practices with plastic beads, because, I mean, not beads, shells, with plastic shells, because the shells are disappearing due to climate change. So plastics are kind of really like integrated into our lives and our culture and our cultural expressions and our kind of self-expression. And so I wonder about like how we sort of move when we're thinking about sort of human rights, how we think about plastics in that kind of intimacy as well, and how we kind of move beyond plastic while also kind of engaging with how much we like it and need it and use it in growing ways.
Thanks a lot for that, Dina. And I'm sure the panelists are itching to answer that question. Indeed, the next question is about the human rights approach, which I think ties in really nicely with what you've asked. And just to add to the question, Dina, thinking about the ways in which we're using plastics as even for advancing human rights. So I think about water, for instance. And if I asked here, how many of us have drank from a plastic bottle in the past, 2 weeks? I'm sure lots of hands will go. Sometimes people don't have a choice. That's what's presented to them. Not because they don't want tap water, but because they've been presented with bottled water for one reason or the other. So I think it's really about, for me, it's about thinking holistically, and thinking beyond the short and immediate terms, because it's not just about providing the water here and now, but it's thinking what happens next after they've drunk the water, what happens to the bottle, and how do we ensure that we're not creating more problems? Because if you think about the way in which we dispose of the bottles, and perhaps that creates problems for a community elsewhere, creating environmental justice issues, then it comes full circle, isn't it? And then it brings up all these issues about the power relations and how we might be meeting the needs of the powerful, but at whose expense? At the expense of the least powerful. Well, I see Engobo's thinking about it already, so I'll ask her already, while the other panelists should please also get ready and feel free to jump in as you feel led to. So the question really is, how can the human rights approach come into all of this?
Okay. Thank you very much, Pedi. Thanks, Ire. Thanks, Court and Dina. This is one of the times I would actually just like to just sit back and listen and really learn, because I think part of the thing that came across from Ire's presentation, sort of laid the template for this panel discussion, is really these interlinkages between different things, between plastics, climate change, the circular economy, back to human rights, and how we use different mechanisms, different processes, different approaches in addressing what is a common problem. And I think for me, the question you asked, Dina, is really, really germane, because it speaks to the intricacy and the complexity of the problem, because sometimes we forget just how intertwined our lives are on a daily basis with these issues. And it's sometimes easy to just point the finger and look at them rather than at us and how we are part of the problem and therefore part of the solution. And so, for instance, Pedi's example, for instance, about water and how we use water and how we have access to water. And that leads me to the second question, which is that it's the same basic environmental question we've always had, which is that it is a question of power. And that is not just political power, it is financial power, access, and impunity. And all of those are integral to why I think a human rights approach is important. So why do I say it's about power, both political and financial, economic access? the discussion we are having today, the discussion around plastics, the generation, the use, the disposal, which impacts on all of us, is actually caused by a very small proportion of the global population. Huge swathes of the global population do not use plastics in the way that we use them. Or even when they have access to plastics, find ways in which, I'm not saying it's the best way to go forward in terms of what we're thinking about, but they find ways to reuse, they find ways to recycle. You will find that amongst the poorest populations, one plastic, so-called single-use plastic bag will go a long way. It will be reused again and again and again in different ways and in different forms. Whereas for most of the affluent in society, we are the ones, and I include myself in that because I think I am privileged, I have access. We are the ones who buy the bottled water, dispose of the bottled water. We're the ones who have those parties in certain societies in which it is a sign of influence and affluence that we provide these things in these packages, that we provide the single-use cups and plates, because it is a sign of affluence. It's a sign that we don't want to disturb our lives by having to wash up afterwards and all that entails. Now, how do I link that to the human rights question? The human rights question really is about this idea that as part of humanity, we all have certain basic rights. And I think, for me at least, it is settled that environmental right, the right to an environment of a particular quality, is a fundamental human right, whether that be in the form of an expressly recognized right in constitutions or in regional instruments or through the courts. We find that across the world, there are different ways and different processes by which we recognize that right. And it is essential because it links back to that fundamental question that the environment and the fundamental human rights are intricately linked. I mean, we've already settled that with climate change as well, in the sense that the impacts of climate change, how it affects different people disproportionately, cuts across a range of human rights. And I think it's the same with plastic. We've talked about, for instance, the impact of plastics on health, the impact of plastics on fishery resources, the impact of plastics on sanitation, and therefore the impact of plastics including on sustainability, how people continue sustainable livelihoods because of the impacts of plastics. So I think what a human rights approach does is it brings down back the question fundamental basic level, that this is about lives and livelihoods. This is about health and sustainability. And while there is an anthropogenic lens through which we look at human rights, we recognize that through that lens, it is also possible to begin to think about ecosystems and resilience in those ecosystems. Because if we protect our access, our use, our pollution of the environment, we are invariably protecting ecosystems and the ecology in those areas. And it is important because it takes me back to the question about power, that when we say, let's make rules, let's make laws, let's make legislation, policies about these issues, oftentimes it's about who has the strongest voice and the loudest voices. And there are lobbies, we know that, against some of the most stringent regulations or legislations that we may have. Some countries have been very effective in banning single-use plastics, for instance, but oftentimes we find that there are lots of loopholes, caveats. They say single-use plastics are banned, but they're not banned in most countries. It simply means that you have to pay for it when you go to the shops. So what happens if I have enough resources and I'm not sufficiently educated about or aware of or concerned about the environment? I simply pay 5p in my country or 10p and I get the plastics and I go home and I dispose of them. And so invariably you find that legislation goes some way, but not all the way. Okay. And so if we look at this through a human rights lens, where we begin to say we need to adopt a human rights approach that goes beyond, I believe, the legislation itself to some of our human rights instruments as a means of protecting and preventing plastics misuse. And I think Ire spoke to that around some of the litigation that have been ongoing around plastics linked to human rights. And those have relied upon human rights frameworks to take forward if you like, the interests and the concerns of the vulnerable, future generations, those who do not have a voice. We also know that human rights frameworks invariably provide better access, because through a human rights lens, we can sometimes circumvent some of the procedural challenges that we have for seeking access to justice, whether that be participatory rights, whether that be right to information, or whether that be right to a forum to adjudicate. A human rights approach, a human rights framework rather, provides some of those opportunities for individuals from regardless of background to have access to seek justice. I think it also frames the question in a way that I think recognizes the fundamental nature of this issue. Because people say, well, we may be demeaning human rights by claiming that everything is a human right. And my answer to that is to say, that is the fundamental question. What is more fundamental? What is more important to us as human beings than our own survival, our right to life, our right to food, and our right to health? And if those are being in one way or the other infringed, then of course that question becomes fundamental. And those are some of the questions that the special rapporteur of business and human rights and environment have tried to explore and to answer and to respond to. And it is clear from the evidence that looking at these questions through a human rights prism does empower people who would ordinarily be disenfranchised: women, the poor, the uneducated, those who do not have access to power, to access forums, sometimes even outside of the domestic jurisdiction, if politicians are not, if you like, sufficiently persuaded to take forward some of these actions. So for me, the human rights lens, or the human rights approach, or the human rights framework, however we want to frame it, is essential to understanding the problem of plastics and climate change, to looking for solutions to the problem of plastics and climate change, and ensuring that all groups have equal access to ensuring that their rights are protected through a human rights prism, even where they may not necessarily have the power to do so. And I think when we look at some countries in which we see some of these examples taking place, for instance, I was quite impressed, for instance, by Tanzania's approach to banning plastics. They literally just ban plastics. It's not a question of, well, you can pay for a single-use plastics or whatever. They just banned, and they are finding ways around the problem. Because I think when we take that kind of really stringent approach, then as human beings, we come up with solutions and we create sustainable means and improve livelihoods, as well as sustainable businesses for new people who are creative to enter into those spaces, provide alternatives. And that's how we build resilience. That's how we build adaptability. That's how we really have a circular economy to speak of. And then I think to Dina's point about what do we do with plastics that are already here, I'm every day confronted again with sometimes the poorest of the poor, looking for really innovative ways in which we use plastics through art, for instance. Yeah. And that becomes a lot more sustainable than what we currently have. So how can we utilize the opportunities that we have to perhaps support some of these people through financing or other means to help them scale up some of these operations that they currently have in their domestic jurisdictions? And I think, again, having that kind of broad approach will help engender that kind of transformative response to the plastic challenge. I think I've spoken for quite a bit, so I'll keep quiet now and just allow other people get in. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Engobo. I don't know if anyone else wants to say something in response from the panelists. Does any other panelists want to speak to that question? Okay. I would also just say that as it's a summer school and we're exploring different options, perhaps there's also room for us to think about the ways in which existing human rights can form a basis for, again, addressing plastics pollution crisis and then the climate change crisis. So when Engobo was speaking, for instance, she talked about the right to life, the right to health, and I think the right to, was it a healthy environment? Now, all of these have already in one form or the other come up in response to climate change. For instance, if you look at climate change litigation, there are strong human rights bases or strong human rights approach as a basis for litigating climate change. But I think similarly, we could start to explore the human rights, whether it's the right to life, because of course we know the implications of climate, of plastics for both human life, but also animal life. We could think about even the right to water, the right to education, the right to food, because we know that plastics pollution has implications for food, and indeed the climate crisis has implications for food. So I think there's room for us to explore existing human rights that may already be established in various frameworks, whether it's the national frameworks or the international regional, as a basis for, addressing plastics and climate crisis together, because that way we are maximizing the existing rights frameworks and also thinking about the various human rights principles. So one of the points that Scott made was around indigenous knowledge and ensuring that we're having these communications with people at the grassroots. And I think that's really key. And if we come back to the human rights principles, we have the principle of participation, we have accountability, we have transparency. So all of those human rights principles already provide us with some tools we can explore further as we try to tackle this crisis. So thank you very much, Engobo, but thanks a lot to Dina for the question, and thanks, Scott and Ira. I think I have a question for Adenike because she hasn't spoken just yet. So I have a question, and it's really linked to the human rights issue, but also the issue around circular economy and the broad aspects of sustainability, which we cannot forget as we talk about climate change and as we talk about plastics. So the question is, how do you think we can possibly achieve an inclusive approach towards global circular economy transitions for addressing plastic pollution, bearing in mind the complexities and the differences in economies, but also in power relations, in societal structures within countries and across countries? Over to you, Adenike.
Thank you very much for this very crucial question. So for us to address plastic pollution through global circular economy transition, we need to look at it from a very complex point of view, and we need to employ inclusive approach. And during Iri's presentation, she talked about the numbers, and just so that we can look at it, we know that there are about 8 million metric tons of plastic that enters our ocean every year. And more so in coastal communities, coastal communities are usually much more affected than other communities because of the plastic pollution that is going on in that community. So, and she also mentioned Philippines, and if you look at this statistics, you can see that in Philippines alone, the number of emission of plastic waste to the ocean per capita is about 3.3 kg, which is quite high. And a lot of diseases are quite associated with plastic waste, especially in developing nations. For instance, this study was performed in Nigeria, in a local government in Cross River State. And it shows that about 24% of diseases that are in terms of cholera are associated with plastic waste. And a lot of maternal health diseases, for instance, that shows that plastic waste, microplastic, can impair fertility in all mammalian species. So why am I saying all these things? When you're talking about plastic, why people should recycle their plastic, first have to look at the Maslow hierarchy of needs before we can now talk about inclusivity. Because most people, especially in coastal communities, I'm using coastal communities as a case study, is that countless of women and girls don't have access to the basic physiological needs, which is air, water, food, shelter, clothing, etc. So if you want to address the issue of plastic waste, we have to make sure that these women and girls are, firstly, they're empowered. And the primary occupation in coastal communities is fishing, and plastic pollution do affect their livelihood in profound ways. So if you look at these pictures were taken about in a course of 5 to 10 years, because I've been doing a lot of research in coastal communities. And these are women in a coastal community in Nigeria. going about their everyday activities, fishing. So we need to include them in decision-making processes. And it's interesting because we have to look at what are their unique perspectives, what are some of the indigenous knowledge that they have. And because these knowledges will become invaluable, so we need to prioritize them having access to jobs and jobs that revolve around the problem. So are there businesses, are there solutions that, are there startup income that, or capital that can be given to these girls to transition into the circular economy initiative? And also we need to support them by helping them, teaching them, and also help having access to incomes so that they can start up their own businesses. So also global cooperation, we need a very robust policy framework. Robust policy framework is not negotiable. So there should be advocate for international agreements and policies that set clear targets for reducing plastic pollution. And for instance, imagine we have something similar to Paris Agreement, but this focus on just plastics. So government can also implement taxes and incentives that favor circular economy practices. And this will contribute to the well-being of coastal communities. For instance, in Nigeria, there are a lot of funds that have been allocated to these coastal communities, but they are mismanaged because of corruption. So how do we check that the funds that are supposed to go to mitigate some of this plastic pollution in coastal communities, how do we check that they're actually being channeled to the right departments, or making sure that some of these projects are actually done? So some of the case studies from, for instance, like Europe, the European Union has a single-use plastic target specific to plastic items for reduction and recycling, but we don't have that, for instance, say in Nigeria. And in cities like San Francisco and Tokyo, they've been able to effectively reduce single plastic through regulations and public awareness program. So these success stories are things that countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and other countries can learn from to see how they can make sure that women and girls, because they are the ones that are most affected, how can they be included, and how can we monitor, and how can we have an accountability system to track the process of this plastic waste, if they're being reduced or not. And also industries should be held accountable. For instance, in coastal communities, this is not necessarily related to plastic, but in coastal communities in Nigeria, you have a lot of oil production. And when the waste from the oil activities are usually discharged into the water bodies, there's no regulation, there's nobody that is holding this oil company into to account for this, or are these wastewaters, are they being treated? So there's no regulation and things like that. So industry should be accountable for meeting targets and reducing their plastic footprints. And hopefully when they're doing that, then we can see some kind of positive impact. So just to answer your question, mostly everybody is affected by the plastic waste, but women and girls, especially from the case study of coastal communities, are much more affected. And we need to come up with different things like education, small loans for microfinance loans to help them to create businesses around the plastic waste. And so transitioning into this global circular economy is a concerted effort, and it involves everyone from individuals, from government and industries. And we need to tap into indigenous knowledge, because some of the solutions that we'll have in developing countries might not necessarily work for, developed countries might not work for developing countries. So we need to tap into how can we talk with, for instance, the youth leader, the kings of the communities, to see how they can translate some of the solutions into local knowledge. And the thing is, surprisingly, most of these communities are already practicing some form of recycling or some form of reusing. They just don't know that's what they're doing. For instance, in most places, when you have plastic bottles, you see a lot of market women, they will use those plastic bottles. Maybe they use it to maybe it might not be water. They might put in, like, if they produce palm oil, they might put that palm oil into the plastic bottle. They're already doing it. They just don't know that that's what they're doing. So we need to amplify that. And yeah, I hope that answers the question a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adenike. I mean, you've mentioned at least the 4 key things in relation to promoting that global circular economy through an inclusive approach. So there's financing, there's education, there is multi-stakeholder approaches involving various parties and also ensuring that we integrate indigenous knowledge. And I think Adenike also mentioned something really crucial around the plastics, well, the plastic crisis linked to, for instance, oil and gas pollution in coastal communities. And Dina, maybe I should just mention now that we have another session tomorrow, which actually deals with the intersections between the fossil fuel industry and pollution issues and how we can possibly achieve just transition through, again, a human rights approach. So I'm inviting all of you to come there and let's explore these in a bit more detail. But we've got 2 questions in the chat box. While the other panelists think about this issue of the circular economy, because that's something that's really becoming more and more popular, and explore the ways in which we can do that through an inclusive approach. If you don't mind, I'll also read out the questions we have in the chat box, and then the panelists can speak to those. The first 2 questions, I think, are interestingly linked, and you'll see why I say so. The first question, and thank you very much for the question. So thank you, Natalia Uzola. Natalia says, thank you for such insightful presentations. I have one question. Do you think we need a new human right related to plastic? And if so, what would that look like? That is one. Now, the second question, which I think is connected, and I'd like you to think about them together, is from Devdata Mukherjee. Apologies if I haven't pronounced your name correctly. The comment and question is, thank you very much for the interesting insights. Does the anthropocentric obsession of human rights discourse automatically translate to promoting ecosystem resilience? The idea of focusing on certain vulnerable groups of humans has been around for some time, but we have simultaneously been facing accelerated depletion of the environment. Should and could the focus shift? So on the one hand, do we need a new human rights focused on plastics? On the second hand, are we even going in the right direction, thinking about this as a human rights issue? Yes, Irekpitan, Okukpon.
Thank you, Pedi. With your permission, I'd just like to respond to Natalia's question about including human rights in plastics. As I earlier mentioned, this idea of viewing the Plastics and Climate Change Treaty through a human rights lens kind of gained impetus since the United Nations resolutions. Now, the key problem, and Professor Engobo mentioned this earlier, is the push and pull factor when trying to negotiate a treaty to include certain human rights obligations of parties and how they should implement it, both at the international level and at national levels. So the Global Plastics Treaty, apart from the usual wordings of environmental treaties of prevention and other paradigms, what it seeks to emphasize is that any single approach or mechanism relating to plastic pollution, plastic waste, or climate change must take into consideration the human rights of individuals, especially the vulnerable, the marginalized, women and children, etc. That particular treaty is supposed to be an overarching treaty that kind of takes charge of these issues that we have discussed. But as usual for treaty negotiations, you have this particular camp or group of persons, the G5 nations, fighting for a particular thing or trying to resist to ensure that the obligations on them are not too cumbersome. So it remains to be seen in 2024 what the treaty will do, but there are a lot of hopes that the human rights element is clearly reflected in this approach towards plastic waste and plastic pollution. I don't know if that answers your question, Natalia, and I think other members of the panel can contribute also. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ira. I think I see Engobo's hand up.
Sorry, I was trying to put up my hand, but wasn't doing so successfully. So I thought I'll do the, analog mode of raising your hand.
It works perfectly.
Right. Two things. I think the first, Ira, you really captured it there. I don't think the question is about a separate human right to plastics, because I don't think we need one. it really, I think, from my understanding, is about looking at the issue through a human rights lens and saying, what are the human rights issues? Who are the groups, the vulnerable groups, just like Adenike was saying, that are impacted by this, such that whatever solutions we find within this treaty needs to take that into account. And I think the second issue related to that is that I think that's important because there is still this debate, although, like I said, personally, I don't think there should be a debate. I think it's settled. But there is still this debate, there's still this clamor that the right to an environment is not a unique, separate human right. And I think by trying to be inclusive, by trying to use that broad approach within the treaty, it sort of addresses that concern such that we realize that we cannot address plastics without invoking a human rights lens to look at it. That's my understanding of the treaty and the approach it seeks to adopt. I think the second question is a really interesting one, and actually one that I engage with my students a lot of the time. You know, is an anthropogenic approach, an anthropocentric approach necessarily responsive to environmental concerns for purely ecological reasons or ecosystem reasons? I think a simple answer is no, because we do know that when we take a purely anthropocentric lens to the right to a healthy environment, we are only concerned with those things that affect us directly. And therefore, as humans, we can be quite selfish in how we view the environment and how we view the problems relating to the environment. A simple example I give my students is just look at any advert around which species we want to save when we talk about extinction. We talk about those species and we put the picture of the spotlight on those species that we find attractive, we find useful, not necessarily the species that are most essential for the ecosystem survival. So I agree with you. I don't think it necessarily addresses the ecosystem concerns through a purely anthropocentric lens. However, I think we've been making progress through the years from a purely anthropocentric lens, looking at human rights to a healthy environment, to more broadly thinking about environmental rights, which includes ecological ecosystem rights. And I think Christopher Stone's book, 1972, it's aged very well. I think it was 51 years now this year. And we find that his fundamental question, where he was asking, do the non-human inhabitants of our world, of the earth, do they have less rights than we do? Should they also have standards? And I think that the philosophical discourse he had around how we as human beings have progressively come to recognize, different groups as worthy of rights, me included, on several fronts. As a woman, for several years, I wouldn't have had some of the rights I now have. As a Black person, I wouldn't have had some of the rights that I now have. As a disabled person, I wouldn't have had the rights that I now have. So this idea that human rights is progressive, it is continuing, and that we increasingly bring in facets, aspects of the discussion that were previously not encompassed within the mainstream orthodoxy of human rights. And I think we now find that there are cases, for instance, where we're now saying water, water bodies have rights in some countries that have been decided. So I think the right to a future generation, right of future generations, where we're saying unborn persons, who previously would not have had rights, actually have rights within the environmental sphere. So I think there is a movement. And I think the more we kind of articulate these various discussions through a human rights prism, and we bring all of these concerns together, I think we'll make even further progress, where we begin to see beyond just anthropocentric rights to broader ecosystem environmental rights. I hope.
Thank you very much for that, Engobo. And I think, does any other panelists want to weigh in? Scott, Adenike, I was just going to add that it's also the second question, especially around the fact that we've been focusing on certain vulnerable groups of humans for some time now. and but we have simultaneously been facing accelerated depletion of the environment. I also want to remind us that even those so-called vulnerable groups of humans that we have been focusing on, if we look back, have we really made success, or have we recorded good success in terms of addressing the issues pertaining to the vulnerable groups? And perhaps the answer is no. So I think I would encourage us to also not think about it as a zero sum. It's either human rights or it's ecological issues. No, not so much, because we still have real human rights concerns even today. If we look back to the 1966 Convention, whatever we look at, whether it's the right to, even the right to life, privacy, whichever rights we want to look at, those concerns still exist today. So I think we should just be reminded about the need to address the concerns as we go along, not necessarily one or the other. And like Engobo has mentioned, even the rights approach is becoming more and more relevant in protecting the environment in itself. So we've got the rights of nature, no longer exclusively our rights to nature, but the rights of nature in and of itself. So there are synergies which we can explore as we go along. But thanks a lot for those questions. There's another question here. Thank you, Dina, for putting those details in the chat box. There's something from Clivinte. Good discussion indeed. Please clarify the idea of a circular economy more and elaborate more on the climate change nexus implicated here. So while I'll see if any of the panelists wants to speak to this, but I can also just say that with the circular economy, it's really this idea that we want a closed loop. So as much as possible, whenever there's waste generated, we want to be able to reuse it. But of course, we want to even start by reducing, because fundamentally, what is waste? Waste, one person's waste could be another person's treasure. I really find it interesting when I see garage sales. And this idea that someone has had this thing packed up for so many years and maybe wants to even just throw it away and then decides, well, maybe I can make some money off it. And they really make money off it. And interestingly, there are these rhymes for kids, also toddlers, and it's actually called garage sale. And it says, one person's waste is my treasure. And I think ultimately that's what the circular economy is about. The idea that it is waste at one end, but we want to explore as much as possible how we can derive value from it and reduce what goes out into the environment as waste. So even as it goes into the environment, we want to release it into the environment in a way that has the least possible adverse impact on the environment that we're releasing it into. So that essentially is what the circular economy is about. So that closing of the loop. And that's in itself, if you ask how is climate change nexus implicated here, I think from the one end, if we agree that we want to reduce waste in a circular economy approach, the fact that we want to reduce how much we're taking out of the environment to produce things, resource utilization, sustainable resource utilization, that is one starting point. But also the fact that we want to, as much as possible, not use carbon in that process. Again, that is the implications or connections with climate change. And then if we go from the production of whatever materials they are and reducing, so climate change mitigation in that process, we could also think about adaptation in a sense. So how can that waste contribute to climate change adaptation? And how can we, in reducing what goes out to the landfills, in reducing what goes out to, whatever other means of disposal of waste, in reducing all of that, how can we ensure that we are conserving the resources and then reducing greenhouse emissions in that process? And if we want to extend it a bit more in relation to the right to a healthy environment and how this could be connected to circular economy, if we also think about the rights of the people who are involved in that circular economy process, that also becomes important, because we can't take it for granted that, there's a lot of conversations around the fact that a green economy, a low carbon economy, a low carbon transition does not necessarily protect the rights of the most vulnerable people. So again, in the way in which we organize that circular economy, there are human rights implications and there are human rights to environment implications as well. So those are some of the nexuses in the production process, in the management of the materials or the resources, and in reducing how much waste gets released into the environment, but also protecting the rights of the people involved in the full cycle, from the users to the producers, the consumers. All of that has human rights implications. I don't know if the other panelists want to add to this. Yes, Ire.
Thank you, Pedi. Just to add to what you said and to elaborate a bit more on the circular economy approach. Like Pedi said, it is a closed loop approach and one that seeks to reduce pollution as much as possible. Over the past few years, the extended producer responsibility approach has been used or applied towards waste prevention and pollution. And what that basically means is more like an overarching view of everything we have discussed. The extended producer responsibility approach sees the producer of a particular product, for example, plastics, as being responsible for that product from the manufacturing process till it reaches its end of life, to the point of disposal. So what that basically means is that the producer of that particular plastic has the right or has the responsibility to ensure appropriate information relating to the management of that product is adequately given out to consumers. What this also means is that the producer or manufacturer of a particular product must take into consideration the idea or the principles of a circular economy and ensure that the products that are being used are not products that, when they are released into the natural environment at its end of life, do not contribute to climate change. So a circular economy approach towards plastic pollution, towards climate change, is one that is being strongly advocated and actually situates all these discussions that we have been speaking about, educational awareness, information, and all that. And also, just to jump on what Adenike previously mentioned, the idea of environmental information and awareness is one of the key solutions to this issue of plastic pollution and climate change. As much as legislations are a good approach, which Engobo emphasized, they do not go all the way. And as such, this idea of environmental education and awareness about what the circular economy seeks to achieve is very important. Thank you, Pedi.
Thank you very much for that. And indeed, we have a question around climate, around the education aspect, which we will throw back to our panelists to expand on a bit more. I see that there was a question around gender from Dina, which Adenike has also addressed in the chat box. And I think that's a very important question, because a lot of the times, indeed, there's a very thin line between mainstreaming gender issues, and this could also apply to other groups in vulnerable situations, and passing the burden on to those groups of individuals. And that's something that we have to always be mindful of. So Adenike has mentioned the very important aspect of a gender impact analysis in whatever we propose, so that we have a clear understanding of the implications. And another thing to also remember is that we need the voices of whichever group we're trying to support in the room, because those groups would be in the best position to actually say, this is a solution that works for us or not, and this is why. And they would also be in the best position to forge an outcome that will suit their interest most, because it's one thing to look from the outside and suggest. It's another thing for someone who has that lived experience to actually sit and say, look, this is what it is for us. So indeed, that's a very important issue that we need to address, this idea of mainstreaming gender and other vulnerable groups, but also ensuring that those voices are represented in the room. And actually the power differentials are addressed, because it's one thing to have those voices in the room, but it's another thing for those voices to actually be heard and to influence the processes and the outcomes. So I think linking up to that, Adenike, you had some examples of, because we've had a lot of questions around circular economy and conversations around that, you had some examples of business models that could be used to address the climate change and plastics pollution crisis. And part of the reason I'm asking that question is because financing has also come out as an important aspect of sustainable solutions to the crisis. So would you want to speak to that really briefly, and then we go into another question around education?
Yes, thank you. So this year, there was something called the Afri-Plastic Challenge. It was sponsored by the Canadian government, and it was, I think it was administered by Nestor Challenges in the UK. So what they're doing is they're funding projects that are aimed at reducing marine plastic pollution. So I think the funding was about £4 million. So what they do is pretty much they give, so the first stage of the start, when you register to be part of the competition, at the first stage, you get £10,000 to test it like a proof of concept. And then once they make sure that that concept is being proven or is a little bit scalable, then you move on to the next stage. And then you get £100,000 and then move on to the next stage. And then that's when you get the winner of 4 million and 1 million and I think 500,000. So there's been a lot of businesses. I can show you some of the businesses that were done. Like for instance, they have some, just give me a second, let me see. So they have this lady from Nigeria, GNHRE-UNEP is a waste management company in Lagos. And what they're doing is they're recycling and upcycling waste materials, including plastic and even paper. And I think the interesting thing that recycling does is that they do give points. So people in the local community can come to the drop-off session, drop-off points, and they give points for every waste that you drop. So at the end of the month, you can come back and say, oh, I have 2,000 points. I can either get cash for that, or I can get something that I need in my house. So for instance, I might say I need, I don't know how to, so maybe I need like a recharge card, or I need a fan. So they give it, so it's either you take the cash or you use it to claim something that you need. And these businesses have proven that they're scalable. There's another one, GNHRE-UNEP, and this business for the After Plastic Challenge won about £1 million to scale up the business idea. And that's, by scaling up, it just means to have more collection points and be able to recycle more products. So what they are doing at this particular business is they're transforming the plastic waste into valuable products. So they usually process them into like pellets, and then they sell those pellets to companies that need them. And also we have recyclers. So we have a lot of business ideas. And this lady, I think, is much more interesting, is one of the challenge winners. It's called Planet 3 And what she does is she turns plastic into some of the items that you can see. So into making bags and clothes and things. And recently, I think the business got an endorsement from a detergent company. So what they did was they started collecting a lot of waste from detergents, and she was able to change those plastic waste into school bags for kids. So they're getting like they're getting a lot of corporate organizations to sponsor these initiatives. And also by turning them into new products, they're also making money from the projects. These are just simple projects from the Afro Plastic Challenge. Of course, there are a lot of other projects that are aimed as, for instance, in building houses. A lot of houses now are being built with plastic. Some of them you can see the plastic, some of them they mix some of the materials like sand with plastic pellets. They have been proven to be more durable. We've seen cases I use Nigeria as a case study because I'm more familiar with the environment. There's been a case in Abuja, Nigeria, where they use plastic to make roads for roads constructions and things like that. So there's been a lot of ways that people have been doing that. We also have something called the Captain Fan Plastic. I really love this one. This is actually more on environmental literacy. So what they do is they get a lot of young people to be excited. They have this superhero thing going on. They call it Captain Fan Plastic. So they get young people to dress as pirates, and then they go to like oceans and beaches and things like that, and they clean up their communities. And I think a lot of companies also do sponsor these projects. I really like this one. And one thing I like about this project was there was one of the students that talked about, there was a female astronaut that he really liked. And so what they did was they were able to make that astronaut into some kind of like a cartoon character, and they were able to create a book from that. So they sell those books to kids, and they also use those books to teach the classes. And now they went a step further to bring the astronaut to the schools so that the kids can actually see the female astronaut in real life, something they've been reading about in a book. And for that leads into the education aspect of things, because that leaves a kind of an impression on the kids. So their model is very simple. They select a school. From the school, then they go to the schools and install like different kind of bins in the school, and they tell kids to put their plastic into those bins. And then the recycling partners come to the school with their trucks to take off the trash. And then they turn the trash into something that is useful. So those are some of the projects that I've seen that have been a little bit effective and even scalable and profitable. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Adenike. I really like how these examples you've shown very well relate the interventions, but also explore the business angle of things and possible ways of financing startups linked to plastics pollution, addressing plastics pollution, and perhaps also linked to the circular economy issues that we've already been discussing. Thanks, Sarah. Sarah's session, Sarah Sek has put a reminder in the chat box that is another session following from this one, which will look really into using a framework reflecting a holistic approach to the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment that can inform prevention and remedy of plastics, climate harms and transition, and also transformation, including circularity, drawing on trainings developed by UNEP, SCA Circular. So that's something to look out for. We have a few minutes left in this panel. I mean, I would like each of the panelists to very briefly share any final reflections that you may have in relation to education, environmental education, but also any other issues that have come up in today's conversation. Scott's hands up. Over to you, Scott. You've got 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I was thinking about education, and of course, education is crucially important. But I think education goes both ways. It really does. You know, you can talk to communities and educate them about environmental aspects, but we also need to learn. We need to learn a lot from them. And there's a real danger of telling people how things should be. And I just initially thought of, I'm not sure which country it is, but I remember seeing people brought laptops to a community to teach them about things, and it wasn't practical. They didn't understand that the community wouldn't use this, so they used the laptops as chopping boards because it was more practical for their livelihoods. And I just think that just epitomizes it, you know, completely. It's education goes both ways, really, and it's a starting point, but it also has its limits as well. Where capacities lack, it has to be one part of a more dynamic approach across various sort of disciplines, attacking where capacities lack, which could be education, but also infrastructural and facilitating these kinds of communications, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Scott. Does any other panelists want to say something before we close?
I think just very quickly, I just want to say, I think the other thing that I really want perhaps press home is this idea around the fact that education has to be a two-way street. And I think that's what Scott was speaking to, but also just really around how we place value. I think it's not just about pick the plastic tray with do that and do the other. I think it's really about reorienting people to what has value, what is valuable, and how we begin to rethink what affluence is and all of that stuff. Because as I think I've said right at the beginning, the plastics problem, the plastics crisis is intrinsically linked to consumerism. They're intricately linked. And I think, therefore, that if we are going to have a change in approach on a larger scale, there has to be a reorienting, and that reorienting has to start very early on. So it's both through the formal systems and the informal systems. And I'm just a bit miffed, because when we had the UN Decade for Sustainable Development, one of the things that the UN said, UNEP said at the time, was that we had to integrate sustainability into education. I think we failed largely on that. We still have discrete subjects on sustainability, but I think that we need to integrate that into our learning systems all the way through, as well as all of the other things that we also talked about. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Irekpitan, did you have a hand up? Okay. You're muted.
Thank you, Pedi. My hand was up, but
Okay.
Prof has basically tackled what I was going to say, which is the idea of reorientation. Earlier, I mentioned the cultural perceptions that surround this idea of plastics and plastic pollution, especially in developing countries. So for you to have, in pushing this narrative for environmental information and environmental education, we need to understand that it starts with reorienting people's perceptions and consciousness towards this entire idea of plastic pollution and usage and consumer usage at the end of life of these products. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can't resist asking that as we leave today's session and we go into the second session on plastics pollution and think about the intersections, we should also reflect on the intersections between responses to climate change. And of course, I'm talking about legal responses. So the climate litigation, all those conversations, the principles, the human rights approach, but this issue of just transition, because it's not too soon for us to start thinking about what a just transition will look like, moving away from plastics to what? And that's what implications could it have, not only for the environment, but also for humans and the vulnerable amongst within the society. With that, I think I would say thank you very much from all of the panelists, and I'll hand it back to Dina. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pedi, for managing that incredible panel. Thank you to all our panelists. That was really just a fascinating, dynamic conversation. And I think you brought into light just so many kind of hidden aspects of the political economy of plastics. That this was actually a talk about colonialism and plastics, and race and plastics, and gender and plastics, and power and plastics, and just the way our lives are lived in plastics, and a human rights perspective on all of that is so incredibly valuable. As Sarah said, this is a very special session. It's a joint session. It's an incredibly important year to be thinking about plastics. So we're having 2 sessions back to back. And the next one is going to be looking at transformations and transitions at the climate plastics nexus. We're staying right here in this room. And thank you to our first panelist. I'm going to stop the recording for the purposes of our recording library, and then I'm going to start us up again. So give us a minute, stretch your legs, but stay with us. Don't go anywhere. Thanks, everyone.